The Tillamook State Forest in Oregon is a place of aggressive greenery, a sprawling expanse of temperate rainforest that feels prehistoric in its density. It is a landscape where the moss grows so thick it swallows sound, and the Douglas firs stand like iron bars against the eternal gray sky. It is beautiful, certainly, but it is also indifferent to human life. The terrain is scarred by the history of massive wildfires, the famous Tillamook burn of the early 20th century, which left behind a topography that is rugged, unstable, and deeply isolating. In the autumn of 2019, this forest became the setting for a mystery that continues to baffle law enforcement, geologists, and audio experts alike. The man at the center of this riddle was 34-year-old Julian Vane, a forensic audiophile and field recordist known for his obsession with silence. Julian was not a casual hiker or a weekend tourist. He was a professional who made his living capturing the subtle, often imperceptible sounds of the natural world for high-end film production and therapeutic audio apps. He was the kind of man who could distinguish between the call of a northern spotted owl and a barred owl from a mile away, simply by the cadence of the hoot. Julian was meticulous. He was organized to a fault, a trait likely developed from his years working as a sound engineer where a single decibel of unwanted noise could ruin a take. He did not take risks. He planned his trips with the precision of a military operation, mapping every route, calculating every ounce of weight in his pack, and testing his batteries 3 times before leaving his apartment in Portland. He was a man who controlled his environment, which makes his chaotic disappearance all the more disturbing. On October 4th, 2019, Julian arrived at the Iron Ridge Lookout, a decommissioned fire tower sitting at an elevation of 3,000 feet. He had rented the structure from the Forestry Service for a specialized 2-week project. His goal was to record the base layer of the forest, the sound of the wind, through the ravines before the heavy winter rains set in. He parked his vehicle, a rugged, custom-modified 4x4 SUV, at the base of the access road. He then hiked the steep 2 miles up to the tower, hauling nearly 80 pounds of sensitive audio equipment. He checked in with the local ranger station via satellite text, confirming his arrival. For the first week, everything appeared normal. Julian sent daily updates to his sister Elena, who lived in Portland. Elena was his anchor. They spoke almost every day. His texts to her were brief but enthusiastic. A spoke of the pristine noise floor, a technical term for silence without mechanical interference. He mentioned setting up a perimeter of omnidirectional microphones to capture a 360-degree. He seemed happy, focused, and completely alone. The last confirmed contact from Julian came on the evening of October 12th. He texted Elena a photo of the sunset over the ridge, the sky bruising purple and red. The caption read, "Finally caught the sound I was looking for. The frequency is perfect. Going to sleep early." 3 days passed without a check-in. This was uncharacteristic for Julian, who knew that missing a check-in would trigger an automatic search protocol. He was aware of the dangers of the solitary wilderness and respected the rules of the backcountry. On the morning of October 16th, Ranger Davis, a veteran of the Forestry Service with 20 years in the Tillamook district, drove up the access road to conduct a welfare check. The morning was bitter cold, and a heavy, wet mist clung to the ridge, obscuring the tops of the trees. When Davis reached the clearing, he saw the tower standing silent against the clouds. There was no movement in the windows, no smoke from the chimney. The structure looked abandoned, a sentinel watching over nothing. Davis climbed the 40-foot steel staircase, his boots ringing out on the metal grating. The sound echoed into the valley, but there was no response from above. When he reached the catwalk, he found the heavy steel door closed. He knocked, announcing himself, shouting Julian's name into the wind. There was no answer. He tried the handle. It was locked. This was the first anomaly, a detail that would haunt the investigation for years. The door to the Iron Ridge lookout was equipped with a heavy-duty commercial deadbolt that could only be engaged from the inside. If Julian had left the tower to go for a hike or gather wood, he would have had to lock it with a key from the outside, engaging the latch but not the deadbolt. But the bolt was thrown. It was solid. This meant someone had to be inside to turn the thumb. Ranger Davis used his master key to override the tumbler, but the deadbolt wouldn't budge. He eventually had to return to his truck, retrieve a heavy crowbar, and force the door open, screeching against the metal frame. When he finally stepped inside, the scene he found was frozen in time, eerie in its normalcy. The small, square room glass on all four sides was warm. A propane heater was humming on a low setting in the corner. On the desk, a cup of coffee sat next to a notebook. The coffee had developed a thick skin of green mold, suggesting it had been sitting for days. But the most haunting detail was the equipment. Julian's primary recording rig, a high-end chaotic array of XLR cables, preamps, and mixers, was powered on. The digital display showed that it was currently recording. The tape reels on the backup analog deck were spinning slowly, mesmerizingly. Julian Vane was gone, but his machines had been listening to the empty room for over 90 hours. Ranger Davis searched the small space. He looked under the cot. He checked the supply closet. It was empty. He looked for the keys. They were sitting on the nightstand, next to Julian's wallet and his glasses. This was the second critical anomaly. Julian was severely nearsighted. Without his glasses, the world was a blur of shapes and colors. He couldn't drive. He couldn't hike, and he certainly couldn't navigate a treacherous cliffside trail at night without them. Yet, there they were, folded neatly beside his sleeping bag. The boots he wore for hiking heavy, mud-caked leather boots swear by the door. His indoor slippers were tucked under the desk. If Julian had left that tower, he had done so barefoot, blind, without money or identification, and without unlocking the door behind him. The sheriff's department arrived within 2 hours. Sheriff Boyd, a man who had seen his share of lost hikers and tragic accidents, was immediately troubled by the locked room aspect of the scene. How does a man vanish from a steel box suspended 40 feet in the air, with the door bolted from the inside and the windows sealed? The windows were painted shut with years of forestry service, maintenance. They didn't open wide enough for a human to pass through. The trapdoor to the roof was bolted from the inside as well. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no blood. The only way out was the door Davis had just forced open. The initial theory was a medical emergency. Perhaps Julian had become delirious from carbon monoxide poisoning, but the detectors in the room were functional and showed normal levels. Had he suffered a stroke and managed to squeeze through a window? Forensics dusted the window frames. The dust was undisturbed. The investigators turned their attention to the recording. If the machine had been running since the 12th, it must have captured the moment Julian left. The audio technicians at the State Crime Lab downloaded the terabytes of data. They expected to hear the sounds of a struggle, or perhaps a medical episode, a gasp, a fall, the sound of a body hitting the floor. Instead, they heard hours of Julian working. The typing of keys, the rustling of a jacket, the sound of water boiling, the mundane soundtrack of a man alone. Then, at 10:14 p.m. on October 12th, the audio picked up the sound of Julian standing up from his chair. The leather creaks. He walks 4 distinct steps to the door. The recording captures the metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding shut. Then, footsteps walking back to the center of the room. A pause. A sharp intake of breath. And then, ... nothing. The sound floor drops. There is no sound of the door opening again. No sound of a window breaking. The footsteps simply stop. It wasn't that he walked away quietly. It was as if the source of the sound ceased to exist. For the next 90 hours, the microphones recorded only the hum of the heater and the wind rattling the glass. While the audio was being analyzed, a massive search operation was launched. Tracking dogs were brought in, bloodhounds, famous for their ability to track scents over weeks-old terrain. They circled the base of the stairs, tails wagging, sniffing the iron. But they found no scent leading away from the structure. They didn't pull toward the woods. They didn't pull toward the road. They simply sat down at the bottom step and whined. It was as if Julian had never come down the stairs. But then, a discovery was made 15 miles away that shattered the timeline completely and turned a missing person case into an impossibility. A contract logger named Mike, working on a private timber road far from the Iron Ridge access point, reported a suspicious vehicle. It was Julian's SUV. This made no sense, physically or logically. Julian had parked his SUV at the base of the tower, 2 miles from where he was staying. Yet here it was, 15 miles deep, into a completely different valley, parked haphazardly in a dense thicket of ferns, almost invisible from the main logging road. The vehicle was locked. When police arrived, they found the keys in the ignition turned to the on position, but the battery was dead. The gas tank was bone dry. The exterior of the SUV told a violent story. It was covered in reddish mudda clay composite not found in the Tillamook forest, but rather found in the high desert regions nearly 200 miles east. The tires were shredded, stripped down to the steel belts, indicating the car had been driven aggressively over sharp rocks. But the most confusing part was the driver's seat position. Julian was 6 feet tall. He drove with the seat pushed back. The seat in the SUV was pushed all the way forward, jammed against the steering wheel. Whoever had driven this car last was short, perhaps 5'2" or 5'3". Sheriff Boyd was now looking at 2 impossible crime scenes. Scene A, the locked tower where Julian apparently vanished into thin air without his glasses or boots. Scene B, the car, found 15 miles away, driven by someone short, covered in mud from a geological zone hours away, with the keys that were supposed to be in Julian's pocket. And connecting them was a timeline that didn't fit. If Julian was in the tower, locking the door at 10:14 p.m. on the 12th, how was his car being driven through the mud 15 miles away? The investigation turned to Julian's background. Was he suicidal? His sister, Elena, insisted he wasn't. He was happy, she told the press, her voice trembling. He was on the verge of a breakthrough with his work. He was planning a trip to Iceland next month to record glaciers. He had just bought $2,000 worth of new gear. You don't buy new microphones if you're planning to die. Financial records confirmed this. There was no debt, no secret romance, no enemies. However, a deep dive into his computer revealed a folder titled The hum. Inside were hundreds of audio files downloaded from obscure forums and dark web archives. They were recordings of low-frequency sound scene for sound reported by people all over the world. Notes in the file suggested Julian believed there was a specific geological frequency in the Tillamook forest that could induce hallucinations or altered states of consciousness. Was Julian experimenting on himself? Did he go to the tower not to record birds, but to hunt this frequency? One of the coordinates circled on a map found in his car corresponded to an abandoned ventilation shaft for a coal mine that closed in the 1920s. This shaft was known to locals as the Throat because of the way the wind howled through it, creating a resonant, flute-like sound. Search and rescue teams were deployed to the Throat. It was a dangerous, unstable area of the forest, prone to rock. Rappelling teams went down into the shaft, their lights cutting through decades of darkness. They found old beer cans, graffiti from the 90s, and animal bones. But at the very bottom, 70 feet down, resting on a pile of shale, they found a single high-tech omnidirectional microphone. It was one of Julian's. It was battered, as if it had been dropped from a height, but the memory card was intact. When they played the audio from that microphone, it didn't capture wind. It captured a voice. It was Julian's voice, but he wasn't speaking to the microphone. He was screaming. The audio is chaotic, filled with the sound of rushing air and scrambling feet. The timestamp on the file was October 12th, 10:30 p.m. This timestamp is the smoking gun of the impossibility. 10:30 p.m. is just 16 minutes after he locked the door of the tower 15 miles away. Even an Olympic sprinter couldn't cover 15 miles of dense, mountainous forest and darkness in 16 minutes, and certainly not without boots or glasses. The authorities were left with a paradox. Either the timestamps were manipulated, or there were two Julians. As the weeks turned into months, the weather turned against the search. Snow buried the higher elevations. The case grew cold. Sheriff Boyd kept the file on his desk, staring at the photos of the locked door and the muddy SUV. He interviewed the few locals who lived off-grid in the area. Most were unhelpful, wanting to be left alone. But one man, an old hermit named Mr. Henderson, told a story that aligned uncomfortably with the evidence. Henderson lived in a cabin about 4 miles from the tower. He claimed that on the night of October 12th, the night of the storm, he heard a vehicle tearing down the logging road. He looked out and saw headlights, but he also claimed he saw something else. He said the woods around his cabin were vibrating. The air felt heavy, Henderson told the sheriff, like right before lightning strikes, but it lasted for an hour. My dog, a coonhound that isn't afraid of bears, hid under the bed and wet the floor, and I saw lights up on the ridge, not the tower light. Moving lights. Fast lights, like fireflies, but big as basketballs, weaving through the trees. Henderson's testimony was dismissed by many as the ramblings of a lonely man, but the detail about the pressure matched the symptoms of infrasound exposure that Julian was researching. Investigators brought in a forensic audio specialist to analyze the silence from the tower recording again. Using advanced spectral analysis, they looked at the frequencies below human hearing, the infrasound range. They found that the silence wasn't empty. Starting at 10:15 p.m., 1 minute after the footsteps stopped, a massive spike in this frequency, the 19 Hz, is often called the fear frequency. It resonates with the human eyeball, causing vision to blur. It can induce panic, dread, and the sensation of a ghostly presence. The spike lasted for exactly 15 minutes, the exact time it would take for someone to travel ... or be taken somewhere else. The investigation entered a darker phase when the digital forensics came back on Julian's laptop. He hadn't just been recording nature. He had been communicating with someone on an encrypted messaging app known as Signal. The user handle he was speaking to was simply hell. Set into siete, the chat logs were fragmented. Most messages were set to auto-delete, but a few remnants were recovered from the cache. They showed a transaction. Julian was paying this person for coordinates. The messages were vague and menacing. The source is active. One read, "Do not bring electronics close to the rim. It wipes them." Another message, sent on the morning of October 10th, read, "They know you are listening. Stop recording at night." Police traced the IP address of Geo_77. It didn't lead to a hacker in a basement. It led to a public library computer in Seattle, Washington. The trail ended there, but it suggested Julian was not alone in his interest in the Tillamook forest. Was he meeting someone? Was the person driving the car Zhu Setente Sechi? The short seat position suggested a smaller persona woman, or perhaps a teenager. The family hired a private investigator, a former federal agent named Silas Vance. Vance didn't look at the woods. He looked at the data. He proposed a staging theory. He believed Julian was killed earlier, perhaps days earlier, and the audio recording in the tower was a fabrication or a pre-recorded track played back to establish a fake alibi for the killer. Vance argued that the person walking in the room on the tape wasn't Julian. "Listen to the footsteps," Vance said in a podcast interview that went viral. Julian had a distinct gait. He had a meniscus tear in his left knee from a childhood accident. He walked heavy on the right. The footsteps on the tape are even, perfectly balanced. That's not Julian. That's a performer. If Vance was right, then Julian was removed from the tower before the 12th. The killer then set up the equipment, played the track, locked the door from the inside using a complex string trick. A known technique in locked room mysteries where a string is looped around the bolt and pulled from the outside, unleft. Then they drove Julian's car to the mine shaft to dispose of the body, dropping the microphone as a taunt or a mistake. But this theory had holes. The string trick requires a specific type of bolt which the tower didn't have. And why leave the heater on? Why leave $10,000 worth of equipment? And where was the body? The cadaver dogs of the mine shaft found the microphone, but they never alerted to the scent of death. They alerted to the scent of Julian, specifically on a tree branch overhanging the shaft, but nowhere else. Then came the phantom call. For months after the disappearance, in February 2020, Elena's phone rang at 3 a.m. The caller ID said Julian Seanswered, screaming his name, begging for him to speak. The line was open for 20 seconds. There was no voice, but there was a sound. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thumping. Thump-thumpis. Thump-thumpis. Police traced the call. It didn't come from a cell tower. It came from a VoIP number, routed through a server in Russia, then bounced back to a satellite uplink in the Pacific. The complexity of the routing suggested high-level technical knowledge. The audio analysis of the thump-thumpius matched the background noise of a large industrial ventilation fan or a respirator. Was Julian being held captive in an industrial facility? Or was this a cruel prank by someone who had hacked his cloud account? The sheriff leaned toward the prank theory, but Elena recognized the rhythm. "It sounds like the ocean," she said, "but mechanical. Like a machine breathing." The final, and perhaps most baffling piece of evidence, surfaced in the summer of 2020. A group of hikers found a boot 3 miles north of the mine shaft. It was a hiking boot, C-Seonsi, matching the brand Julian wore. But Wade's hiking boots were found in the tower. This was a third boot. It was identical to his pair, but it was brand new, never worn. The tread was pristine. Inside the boot was a folded piece of paper, sealed in a Ziploc bag. On the paper was a set of numbers. Coordinates. These new coordinates did not point to a mine. They did not point to a forest. They pointed to a location deep in the Pacific Ocean, 40 miles off the coast of Oregon, directly above the Cascadia subduction. So in the fault line capable of destroying the coast, this twist moved the case from a forest mystery to something far stranger. Why would a missing sound engineer have coordinates to a tectonic fault line in a boot he shouldn't have? Why was there a third boot? Was someone planting evidence to lead the search away from the forest? Or was Julian trying to tell them that the sound he was hunting didn't come from the trees, but from the earth itself? Sheriff Boyd admitted in a final press conference, "We are playing a game of chess with an opponent we cannot see. Every clue we find contradicts the last one. The car says he was small. The boots say he was barefoot. The phone says he is in Russia. The map says he is in the ocean. We don't have a crime scene. We have a puzzle box." To this day, the Iron Ridge Lookout remains closed to the public. Hikers who pass near the base of the tower report feeling nauseous. Birds are rarely seen in the immediate vicinity. The local legend of the hum has grown, with campers reporting the sound of a large machine starting up deep underground during the night. The theories that remain are unsettling, each one darker than the last. Some believe in foul play by a corporate entity. They argue Julian stumbled upon an illegal mining operation or a government test site using infrasound technology. He was eliminated, and the contradictory evidence was planted to make the case look like a supernatural event, ensuring no serious investigation would ever look at the real perpetrators. Others believe in the fugue state. They suggest Julian suffered a mental break induced by infrasound exposure. He hallucinated, staged his own disappearance in a manic episode, and wandered into the woods where he succumbed to the elements. The impossible timeline is simply a result of errors in the police reporting or data logging. And then there is the theory of the stranger. The idea that Geo_77 was a predator who lured Julian out. The person in the car was the killer. The locked room was a masterful illusion. Julian is dead, his body hidden in one of the thousands of lava tubes that crisscross the Oregon underground, waiting to be found. But the most haunting question is the one posed by the final audio file found on the recorder in the tower. It was a file named Success. It was created 3 minutes before the footsteps stopped. The file contains no sound that human ears can hear, but when visualized on a spectrograph, the sound waves form a shape. They don't look like random noise. The waves form perfect, symmetrical, geometric patterns. Julian then went to the woods to record nature. It appears he recorded something else entirely, something that didn't want to be heard. In the end, the forest kept its secret. The rain washed away the tire tracks. The moss grew over the mine shaft. The batteries in the microphones died. Julian Vane is legally declared missing, but in the digital world, his accounts are still active. occasionally pinging towers in random countries for mere seconds, a digital ghost refusing to log off. If you go to the Tillamook Forest today, stop your car, turn off the engine, and listen. You will hear the wind. You will hear the rain. But if you are unlucky, you might hear a low, rhythmic thrumming beneath your feet. And if you do, do not record it. Do not look for the source. Just drive. Because Julian Vane was listening, and whatever he heard, it decided he could never leave.